Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the really influential and, let's be honest, pretty controversial cultural framework of the Brazilian philosopher Olavo de Carvalho. And Carvalho himself really sets the stage for us right here. He's not just talking about Brazil in a vacuum. No, his goal is much, much bigger. He's trying to place its modern cultural battles into the grand sweep of Western intellectual history. In fact, Carvalho himself calls this particular work a user manual for his larger trilogy, so that's exactly how we're going to treat it, as our guide to unpacking his whole argument. So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the guide to his worldview itself. Then we'll meet the two monsters he identifies, Leviathan, the revolutionary one, and Behemoth, the material one. After that, we'll see how these two monsters battle it out, and finally, how he argues Brazil is caught right in the crossfire. Okay, so first up, a guide to the worldview. We're going to look at the core symbolism that really holds his entire analysis together. And the key to his entire thought process, really, is a single, incredibly powerful image. It's this one, William Blake's engraving of two biblical monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan. For Carvalho, these two creatures aren't just ancient myths. They represent two colossal, competing forces that are shaping the modern world. All right, let's tackle that first monster, Leviathan, the revolutionary monster. Now, Carvalho connects this creature directly to the strategy of the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci. The central idea here, in Carvalho's reading of Gramsci, is something called cultural hegemony. Now, this isn't the kind of revolution you might be thinking of, with soldiers in the streets. No, this is about a much slower, quieter process. It's about winning psychological and cultural dominance before you even think about seizing political power. And how does that work? Well, it's a step-by-step process. First, you infiltrate and change a society's common sense. You slowly alter habits and even the language people use. The goal is to achieve psychological dominance, so that when a new regime finally takes over, it feels, totally natural, inevitable even. Carvalho has a name for this. He calls it a molecular aggression. And this is really the crucial point. The most powerful soldiers in this kind of revolution aren't necessarily political activists. According to Carvalho's analysis, an unconscious collaborator, think of a journalist, an artist, or a professor who just helps shift the cultural conversation, is worth way more than 1,000 registered party members. Okay, so that's Leviathan. Now let's turn to the second monster, Behemoth, the material monster. For this one, Carvalho points to the worldview of the New Age movement, and he uses the physicist Fritjof Capra as its prime example. Now, Carvalho is pretty skeptical about the success of thinkers like Capra. He argues it's not about the strength of the ideas, but simply about timing. As he puts it, it says what people want to hear, right when they want to hear it. He sees it as this seductive ideology, one that promises a kind of spiritual, holistic answer to everything, but one that he argues is actually riddled with contradictions. And here's a perfect example of what he means by contradiction. He points out that Capra holds up ancient Chinese texts like the I Ching as a way to escape patriarchy. But then, Carvalho says, if you actually read the text, it says things like, the wife must be guided by the will of the master of the house. For Carvalho, this isn't a small mistake. It's a huge contradiction that he feels undermines the whole worldview. So, if the revolutionary impulse is all about conquering and remaking the world, Carvalho argues this New Age thinking is the total opposite. He sees it as a pendulum swing away from ambition and towards just passive submission to the material world. This whole idea of integrating with nature, to him, is basically a form of surrender. All right, so we've met the two monsters. Now for the main event, the Battle of Monsters. This is where we get to the absolute core of Carvalho's thesis, how these two forces, which seem like complete opposites, are actually connected. Yeah, it really makes you wonder, right? What in the world connects a socialist revolutionary and a New Age physicist? I mean, one side is all about total human control over history, and the other is about total submission to nature. How can they possibly be part of the same story? Well, for Carvalho, the answer isn't in politics, and it's not in physics. It's in the symbolism. It all comes back to Blake's image of Behemoth and Leviathan. And this is how he maps it all out. Leviathan, the monster of the sea, is the tongue. It's that psychic revolt, the constant talk of revolution and subversion he associates with Gramsci. And Behemoth, the monster of the land, is the belly. It's all about material power, conservatism and conformity, the worldview he pins on Capra. But here's the real twist in his argument. Carvalho claims this whole battle between the monsters, it only takes place on what he calls the horizontal plane of history, the day-to-day world of politics and material things. And why? Because he argues modern society has lost its vertical connection, that spiritual link to something higher, something transcendent. And that brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. How does all this grand theory apply to a real place? For Carvalho, the answer is his home country, Brazil, caught right in the crossfire. He argues that Brazil is trapped in this battle, but it's an unconscious conflict. As he says here, the country doesn't even have a clear awareness of the choices it's facing. He describes it as a mental life split into sealed devotions to gods who are mutually unknown. In his view, this leads to a kind of cultural gridlock where nobody can solve the real problems because they don't even understand the fight they're in. He even has a specific word for this battle, a teratomaquia, which literally means a combat of monsters. And this is the ultimate takeaway for him. Neither monster offers real liberation. Why? Because both are missing that higher spiritual dimension. So what you're left with is a false choice. You can either have revolutionary subversion or passive materialism. And in Carvalho's view, both are just dead ends. Which leaves us with the final, very provocative question that his whole framework poses. What happens to a culture when its main conflict isn't between right and wrong or good and evil, but is, as he puts it, a combat of monsters?